Drew Davenport. I'm the public historian of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation and the manager of its Getting Word African American Oral History Project. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Jenna Owens, a part-time guide with the foundation and an intern with the Getting Word Project, a recent hire who's going to do great things with us. And we're going to talk this afternoon about the Getting Word Project, about Monticello's reinterpretation of African American history, and about the enslaved families and their descendants who have gone all over the country, and in fact, all over the world. And so, Jenna, it's a delight to be with you on what I think might be your very first live stream.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's terrific to welcome you as part of the project and our newest edition. We'll talk a little bit this afternoon about the digitization efforts of the Getting Word archive, as well as maybe some of our future endeavors together. So the first question that I would have for you, Jenna, is what inspired you to apply to work at Monticello to be a guide, and then what inspired you to apply to work with the Getting Word African American Oral History Project?
Yes. So I, as you said, I'm Jenna, but I just graduated this past May from the University of Virginia, which is the school that Thomas Jefferson founded. And while I was there, I majored in African and African American studies, and so that kind of got me interested in Thomas Jefferson specifically because I took some courses on him, on the enslaved community, on the general Black community in Charlottesville, pretty in depth. And then I really had an interest in the museum field about my third year of college. And so I wanted to learn more about that, what I could do with that, and how I could share what I was learning. And so I'd actually gotten in contact with some of the alumni from the University of Virginia, and one of them happened to be Nia Bates, who is one of the former directors of the Getting Word Project. And so she actually is the one that told me initially about the internship as a tour guide or an interpreter in the house of Monticello, which is where Thomas Jefferson lived. And so heard about that, applied for it. Once I got that position, started that internship last May is when I started, and have been a guide since, still currently am. But as I was giving the tours, one of the common questions that guests had, and I had, was what happened after Thomas Jefferson's death, what happened to his family members, but also what happened to the enslaved community. And so even Nia Bates, when I had initially spoken to her, she was very ecstatic about the project that she had formerly worked on. And so that also just got me interested in simply what did happen, how could I also interact with that. And I started learning about the Getting Word Project, heard some lectures from you, not actual lectures, but lectures like studious lectures about the project and what the current works were going on, and then heard about the internship for this and applied. And so that's where I am today.
Terrific, Jenna. Yeah. And what you mentioned about where people went and what happened to enslaved families upon Jefferson's death is very much at the heart of this project and this project's mission and its origin. It was founded in 1993 by three really pioneering historians. The genius behind Getting Word is Lucia Cinder Stanton, who was with Thomas Jefferson Foundation for many years and is the acknowledged expert on Jefferson and slavery and all of the enslaved families of Monticello. And Cinder had been working at Monticello for a couple of decades by the early 90s. She had worked with Jim Baer and had put together, had edited the memorandum books. So she knew where Jefferson was and how he was spending money. The memorandum books, of course, is where Jefferson noted down all of his expenses on any given day. And she noticed these transactions occurring. Jefferson would lend money to certain enslaved African Americans, or he would be lent money in some cases, for instance, by his early valet, Jupiter Evans. And she began asking herself some questions about who these individuals were. Again, this is about a generation or more ago, and these questions really had not been addressed by historians. Doing social history, Cinder came up with the idea for an oral history project to trace where descendants might go or might have gone. And she teamed up with Dr. Diane Swan Wright, who, like yourself, is a UVA graduate of the University of Virginia, right? And Getting Word began with Diane's kind of naming the project Getting Word, which came to her in the shower one morning. She realized that people were getting word across the generations to one another in the African American community, in the community of descendants who came from Monticello. And the two of them, Diane and Cinder, who met across economic lines, met across the academy, met across racial lines, collaborated with Ms. Beverly Gray, a consultant in Chillicothe, Ohio, who had grown up in the Black community where Madison Hemings, the son of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, had lived, and where his descendants continue to live to this day, some of them. And the three of them, working together with Beverly as a consultant, went out and interviewed dozens of people, in fact, hundreds of people. We now have 225, a little bit more than that, oral histories with descendants of enslaved people at Monticello through the Getting Word African American Oral History Project. And it's really exciting because oral history is, as Diane Swan Wright would say, a favorite way of passing on family stories. It's not the only way, but it is a favorite way to do that, particularly if someone is interested in the tradition. And she was a brilliant folklorist and oral historian, and I think maybe you've seen some of her interviews in the transcripts already. So just to give you a bit of background there, in the past, since Cinder's retirement in 2012, the project was overseen by Aurelia Crawford, who was, like herself, also a guide. And Aurelia kept these relationships with descendants that Monticello and Getting Word had formed over many years. And she strengthened them and kept care of the archive and preserved the files. And of course, Nia Bates, whom you mentioned, our colleague, took over in 2016, led it for 4 years before leaving for Princeton, a pretty good place to leave to. And you and I are now in this kind of second generation of historians to interact with this project and to lead it forward. So just a bit of background there for you.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you. Would you be able to talk a little bit about the community involvement? We've discussed this project being like a recovery work. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, Jenna. I think with Getting Word is a collaboration between descendants and historians. And Cinder Stanton, myself, Dr. Diane Swan Wright, Beverly Gray, yourself, anyone who works with this project would not be able to do the kind of work that we would do if it weren't for collaboration with descendants and their willingness and their courage to share their family histories. And we always have to remember that for many, many years, actually the majority of American history since the founding of this country, African Americans' words have not been historically have been neglected. They have not been treated in the same way that white Americans' words have been treated, and that is true of family stories as well. And so, when Getting Word historians were invited into descendants of, say, Madison Hemings' home or descendants of Bagwell Granger's home, when they're invited into anyone's home and they're doing an interview with descendants, it's kind of a sacred moment because we are sitting at people's feet and we are giving the respect that is due to their family histories and to their stories. And we co-steward those stories together. And that's one of the reasons why this work is so unbelievably powerful and meaningful. And I think maybe from your experience as a guide, sharing these histories, you feel that resonance when you're talking about these histories.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. And so we will talk about archives, but one of the ways that when we have talked about the Getting Word project, we've kind of described it as an archive of freedom and a family history archive. And so can you explain the thinking behind those terms that we use?
Yes, so absolutely. And when Cinder and Diane began Getting Word, they thought that, and we can see this in the records that we have now. We can see in 1993, they're asking themselves these questions. What can oral histories with descendants of enslaved people tell us about slavery and Thomas Jefferson? And that's a brilliant question. But the answer that they received when they were listening to descendants' histories was that descendants were describing their family histories and experiences in freedom. And so there are actually rarely are there stories directly about slavery in the Getting Word archive. What is much more the case, what is consistent, is that families are describing their experiences through the trials and tribulations of freedom since the end of slavery. And maybe you know from your own studies that it is relatively rare for people who are descended from enslaved people in the United States to have direct oral history about their ancestors' experience in enslavement. And for reasons that you well know, it's uncomfortable to describe these things. And you don't necessarily want to pass on that information to the next generation because you want to help build a better future for your family and your younger folks in the next generations coming up. But there are these stories about people, about perseverance, about success and challenges. And so that's why we're reframing Getting Word, or we're thinking about it as an archive of freedom, because you can trace these families not only during enslavement under Thomas Jefferson, but through the Civil War and into the 20th and 21st centuries even. So currently we are in contact with upwards of 800 descendants of enslaved people from Monticello. And all of their experiences tell us a great deal about what happened after slavery. And so it's this kind of really brilliant looking glass through American history, a cross-section of people across generations. In some cases, we can tell histories of say, Elizabeth Heming's descendants that might now, I think, are in their 9th generation. Okay, so these are long stories, and I don't even think that one book would be enough, but maybe a couple of volumes.
Yeah, it's been incredible to even look at those archives and read so many stories that are so rich. And so, speaking of the archives, can you talk about our current efforts to archive and digitize the Getting Word files that we have, and how did this project for digitizing come up?
Great. So the Getting Word files, we think that they number 45,000 pages. Front and back, that's 90,000 pages. It's 100 archival boxes. These files historically have been working files. Cinder or Diane or Naya Bates, yourself, myself, would dip into the files to do research, right? We use these files to learn more about whatever subject we're researching, whether it's slavery at Edge Hill or what may have happened in Goochland County after the Civil War, or family migrations in the 20th century to, say, New York or to California or to Ohio in the 19th century. So these files were actively being used, and we still use them. But we recently received a major grant from the National Endowment for Humanities to professionally archive and organize our archives here at the Jefferson Library, the International Center for Jefferson Studies. And so we'll introduce you to two of our archivists in just a moment here, but this work will help us see what we already have, because we have so much. I can remember being a fellow at the International Center for Jefferson Studies 4 years ago and walking into the Getting Word office and seeing these huge filing cabinets of material, and opening the filing cabinets and seeing the subject headers written on each of these folders, and very specific subject headings. It could have been about Chillicothe, Ohio, or it could have been about the United States colored troops in the Civil War, or it could have been about, you name the subject. Cinder and Diane had really researched this, had printed everything out. Every visit that they went to at archives across the country, they had made copies and placed in the Getting Word archive. And so now what we will be able to do is archive them so we can share, not just share for researchers, but share with descendants, share with the community, share with journalists if journalists are interested, and of course to preserve and document these histories professionally. So if that grant is a major gift to Monticello and to these histories, it honors these histories, and will continue to, I think, for generations as the archive and the project continue to grow exponentially. And with that, we would transition to introduce you to our two archivists, Suzanne Holt and Calvin Jefferson, who will tell you more about this effort to digitize and archive the Getting Word files. Thank you.
Suzanne Holt. I started as an archivist volunteer in the library 7 years ago, and this August I started working on the Getting Word project as the archival processor.
And I'm Julius Calvin Jefferson Sr. I'm a former employee of the National Archives for 30 plus years as an archivist. I'm also a descendant of 3 of the families that were enslaved at Monticello, and one of the families was enslaved at Shadwell. So my historical life or history actually begins in this country with the Jefferson Randolph Wells family. So this is like coming home for me. to do and help in this research. One of the things that we've discussed over the period is how the Getting Word project actually began. And it began with Cinder Stanton. She was the senior research historian at the time, and Beverly Gray, who was a consultant, who was from Chillicothe, Ohio, and Diane Swan Wright, who was a historian, and they were instrumental in wanting to tell a complete story. And they started this journey, which is still ongoing.
So in Kenwood, there is an office, the Getting Word office, and it had several filing cabinets. And this is where all this material came out of. So literally, we did a rough box count of pages, and it was 450. So to give you an idea, we have about 100 boxes. So it's 45,000 pieces of paper. Basically, starting in August, the files that were at Kenwood were moved down here in literally wagon loads. And we just literally started going through them systematically, trying to figure out where they might belong, what the shape of the archive could be, the different sections of the archive. And these were working files, so there were 30 years of working files. So there was no way they could get archived while they were being in play. So this is pretty much what they looked like. This is kind of a little neat and tidy. And so what we would do is go through and make sure that they were in order. We've ordered them past to present so that you get the whole sense of the story. And we've put family trees together. So it starts off kind of in a chronological order, but there's a sense to it as well. So it's family trees, public census records, photographs, wills, marriage records, all that kind of thing. Then emails between Cinder, Diane, and the individuals, lots of correspondence, and all that has to be organized past to present. So this is kind of what they looked like. We would put flags. Maybe there's a better copy. This might be a duplicate to check later on. Need to find a better copy, that kind of thing. There are a lot of handwritten notes that we had to read through to make sure they were in their right spot. We also had to figure out, this is where Calvin came in, who was who, and determine who they were, what family they might belong to, and then the boxes themselves get labeled. So these are all the subjects that are in this particular box. And so the box itself is organized in a way that you can easily find things, and it has some cohesiveness and it makes sense. So the way the archive worked itself out was there are 5 sections. The project mission, which is the administrative, family groups, oral history, DNA, and research. So it's going out in March for digitizing. It will hopefully come back, I guess, in July or August. And at that point, we will start writing up the finding aid so researchers can find what's in the boxes, what's in the archive. And the finding aid is basically, it's a directory of everything that's in the archive.
Archiving is organizing records that may not be easy to access, and to make those records accessible to the general public. In archiving, what the objective is to keep documents that will assist or help historians, journalists, families, and researchers, help them find the information they need to do their work. That's basically what archiving records is all about.
A lot of times, in this case, not most, but a good percentage of the reports were duplicated, or some were written on, some weren't. And so you have to kind of consider, if you have a clean copy, but you have a copy that has comments on it, you want to keep it because you want to show the historical progression of that document. So sometimes you'll see in the files, there'll be a copy that's semi-clean, somebody else had a copy, they made notes, and you have to keep both because you want both people's information.
Getting Word Holdings begins approximately here on some of these shelves and expands from here, because this is the photographs here. These are the audio visual records, and that would be the records of the interviews, some things that were collected, and some of the things that Cinder and Diane actually recorded to help the staff understand what was going on with Getting Word. And from there, what we have are the textual records that mainly begin here. And textual records are records that are written. They're not visual or audio, but they're written records of interviews, histories of the various families. And that starts here, and we go from there all the way down to, well, we keep going really. Some of the descendants have donated or supplied us with information about their families. And on that information, you will have family trees, you will have some photographs of the families, and you will have documents that show some type of legal followings of the families. Birth certificates, death certificates, plat maps, those kind of documents that show exactly where the families have landed after 1826. And the reason why I use 1826 as a benchmark is that was the year of the first sale of Thomas Jefferson's estate. And that estate means his enslaved populations. This is the how the reference tapes look like of the interviews. And this shows you, what we've done is we've organized it by date. We also have the audio tapes. And the audio tapes are also by date. So therefore, everything is consistent. When you look for either audio or video, what you will need is the date, and that will be in our finding aid. The finding aid will have all that information so people know exactly what they're looking for. One of the things that is happening with the records in the Getting Word project is the donation of artifacts to the foundation itself. For example, Bill Webb, who is a descendant of Betty Brown, ancestor, fought in the Civil War, and what Bill has donated to the foundation are papers documenting his discharge from the colored troops. Another family who has donated some artifacts to the foundation is the Gloria Roberts family. And the Roberts family is descendant of Sally Hemings. Gloria Roberts was a classical pianist who went to school at Juilliard, and the body of her career took place in the 60s and the 70s. And she mainly performed in Europe, in Germany. And what we have from her are CDs of her performance and 2 dresses. These are Negro spirituals that they're performing, and that's one of the types of songs that she actually liked to perform. That kind of goes along with the history of African Americans in this country, because Negro spirituals at the time, prior to 1865, were songs of hope and of freedom. And it comes from people that started here. They started here.
What a fabulous video to see Calvin Jefferson and Suzanne Holt in the archives, and a sneak peek to what happens behind the scenes here at the Jefferson Library for the International Center of Jefferson Studies. Jenna, after watching that video, seeing our colleagues engaged in archival work and explaining processes of doing this specific type of work, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, so when I watched that video, which was very impactful, just hearing Calvin speak and Suzanne, I think one of the things that Suzanne had pointed out when talking about the archives and the processes was not just the fact that we've had the opportunity to receive all these fantastic oral histories from these descendants, but simultaneously we're able to see the processes of the historians of Diane and Cinder as they're doing these interviews and the research that they're able to do. It's just really cool, I think, as I'm not quite a historian, but like seeing how people have worked through all of this, and that we're able to look back at those interviews and see what their thinking was, what their goal was, what their mission and vision were for these interviews, for these relationships that they were building with these families and these individuals. And it's like kind of like we are the descendants of them as historians in this project, and just being able to be a part of that, but also seeing just how complex of a archive we do have, and that there is a lot of work being put in to be able to organize these and be able to later on distribute that in the way that we can.
I love what you said about the process. We can trace not only these family histories, but we can trace the processes of the historians themselves doing this kind of work. And I totally agree with you that we are in this kind of genealogy of historians working for this project. Nia Bates, Aurelia Crawford, ourselves, Brandon Dillard, Krista Dirkscheide, of course, and everybody's parents are Cinder Stanton and Dr. Diane Swan Wright and Beverly Gray. But I saw a quote that in one of Cinder's letters from May 1995, she's writing to someone who's asking if Cinder can help her do more research into her own family. And Cinder was able to be successful in that kind of research and found this individual's ancestors and reported back. And she said, as she's reflecting on this process, she says, "We find that our understanding of connections and relationships is always changing as each tiny discovery alters the perspective." I think that it gets exactly at what you're describing in terms of how the archive behaves and the relationships that emerge from these files. And it's really incredible work that these historians have done over the years to trace family histories of people who were forcibly separated from one another by slavery and afterwards by its legacies, including in some cases racial passing. And so what's it like to see Calvin Jefferson as a descendant, as one of our archivists here to do this kind of work?
Yeah, it's really incredible. Even when you had initially told me that, I was like, what? But yeah, just even being able to have casual conversations with Calvin, and we always end up back like at archives and the oral histories. He knows so much, like an incredible amount. If I have any question about anyone who they're the descendants of, he can like give it to you off the bat. And so I think he's an incredible resource, but also just his passion for the project also, and just wanting to help out in any way that he can, and helping others to be able to find their genealogy, and his willingness to do that. And I think it's just incredible that he has come back to this place that was the home of his ancestors, and he wants to give what he can to help out with this project. Yeah,
it's so impactful and meaningful, and I think Calvin Jefferson represents a lot of what this project is about. And speaking of genealogy, of mentors, he has mentored myself and helped form me quite a bit. And his skill set as an archivist, as someone who's deeply interested and skilled at doing genealogy, as someone who has oral history and will transmit it, get word across the generations, right? As a deeply skilled researcher as well, and open to sharing all of those elements. I think that is such a wonderful example of what Getting Word is, and some of the community members that are within it, and help make Monticello a place that has reinterpreted its African American history, Jefferson's history with enslavement, and legacies of slavery in this country. And when I'm watching Calvin Jefferson and Suzanne Holt and in the back room there, and special collections, and showing this huge archive of boxes and files that we have, I think it's very rare for us as historians to be in the ground as the archive is coming together. Typically, like if I were doing research at the Library of Congress, like I have extensively with the Ralph Ellison papers, or at Georgetown, where I'm doing my doctorate now, I would go to the archives. I would ask an archivist to pull records for me. All of the hard archival work that takes months to do, if not years, to put together and organize in a scientific way has already been done, and I never get to see that. But here, as an historian here with this project, thanks to this NEH grant, we were able to see and help form how the archive appears, and actually the archive tells us how it will appear, right? Because we're learning how it behaves. But I think it's very rare to see, from our perspective as historians or historians in training, to see an archive come together, and what's more, to do it with two archivists, including one who is a descendant of several of the families enslaved by Jefferson. So really an incredible testament to the work at hand.
Yeah, absolutely. And so with these many oral histories that we have in the archive, can you talk about some of the family stories that have emerged from the Getting Word project, some things that have popped up, or themes that you see across the board?
Themes that very early identified by Senator Stanton and Dr. Diane Swan Wright were fulfilling the Declaration of Independence, the importance of religion, the importance of family, those in education, fourth. So those four themes were very early on identified as kind of emerging from these stories. So whether it is the story of Peter Fawcett, a son of Joseph Fawcett, who was sold at the age of 11 in January 1827, and it was continued to be enslaved for another 25 years away from his family. Peter Fawcett had, by the light of a candle at night, taught himself how to read and write, and taught other people how to read and write, other enslaved people, and had actually once or twice gotten caught writing free passes for people who were attempting to self-emancipate. And across the generations, we can see these other stories of the desire and the burning need and love and passion for education, the desire to live out the Declaration of Independence. As Frederick Douglass says, we want to live in a country that will not brand the Declaration of Independence a lie. And I feel like descendants of people enslaved at Monticello, and many of the stories contained in the Getting Word archive, speak to the natural rights tenets, the equality of man expressed in the Declaration of Independence, and actually live that out. It's incredible. And then the importance of religion within communities. Peter Fawcett, who I talked about earlier, founded a church in Cumminsville, Ohio, just outside Cincinnati. There are many countless other examples of such. Even locally here, Union Run Church just down the street in Charlottesville here, founded by two men who had been enslaved at Monticello. And then, so those are the themes that really kind of emerged from the archive. And I've had the distinct honor to interview several people now through Getting Word, including traveling with Nia Bates and Aurelia Crawford to northern Alabama, where descendants of enslaved people who had been enslaved at Monticello continued to reside to this day. Their ancestors had been forcibly transported from Charlottesville, Virginia, down to northern Alabama in the 1840s. Interviewing them, actually we have maybe a dozen or so interviews across a generation or two with descendants of that family there, and they speak about the hardships that their family faced in Alabama in slavery in cotton farming, and then afterwards during sharecropping for another 100 years after the Civil War. So there are just so many stories that come to mind. We saw the papers that Bill Webb, a descendant of Brown Colbert, gave recently to Getting Word, and I happened to receive those papers in New York when I saw him in December, and his wife Eva. They presented us with their ancestor, Bill's great-grandfather George Edmondson's discharge papers from the Civil War, and Bill shared a little bit about coming upon those papers as a child and framing them, keeping them safe, and eventually gifting them to us. And so there are all of these generational stories that can be shared. And so I would then return the question to you, Jenna. You've only been here for a few weeks, but you spend a lot of time with these transcripts. So what stories interest you the most, and what inspires you to continue to do your work?
So the opportunities that I've had to look into the archives, I've really been able to read some of the transcripts as I'm reorganizing the archives, and the stories are just incredible. Some of them are like really funny and just how it just really brings the reality of these individuals and these families, and even the family dynamics and things like that. And so some of the stories that have popped out to me, and some of the individuals that have popped out to me, one of them being George Pettiford. He also goes by Jack Pettiford, but he actually talks about the idea of passing. And so if you are of African descent, African-American descent, and you're fair-skinned to the point that you can possibly pass as white, some individuals would do so. And so he actually talked about his ancestors, people who came before him, who actually decided not to pass as white, even though they had the opportunity to do so. And even with himself, and him personally, how when he was being inducted into the Navy in World War II, they tried to put him into a white unit, and he very firmly told them that he did not want to be a part of a white unit, but rather a Black unit. And that continued to happen throughout his life, where he kept denying that he did not want to be a part of the white side. But his wife actually talks about, I have a quote that really got me, but she said that he would say that this is my line and I want to be what I am. And so just the fact that he had so much pride in his Black heritage and his African-American heritage, and just who he was in that, and him being a descendant of Madison Hemings, which is Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson's son, and just seeing that there's so much pride within these families to continue to be connected with their African-American heritage, I think is so powerful. But another person that I recently learned about, and I'm going to actually have the opportunity to read some of the letters between her and her mother. Her name is Gloria Roberts, and she actually was a very well-known pianist, and she came out with albums. She traveled internationally, and she's also a descendant of Madison Hemings. That's her great-grandfather. And so just learning about Gloria Roberts, I was literally just reading a transcript between her, Cinder, and Diane in an interview from 1999, and she was in Germany at the time and had been living out in Europe for a while. And just hearing how she described her grandmother, and just how connected she was to her grandmother, how much she so much loved her grandmother, and just her being raised her early life with her, and how close she was. It was just very, very, the stories are just so rich. But even like her father, when I heard that her father, Frederick Roberts, was the first Black legislator west of the Mississippi, I was like, what? Just like how rich this history is in them, especially being descendants of Thomas Jefferson, and how people have been involved in politics in that line. And even with Madison Hemings being her great-grandfather, and many of the Hemings were very musically talented, and seeing that she's playing piano and seeing how those things have carried down the line also, just really is very fascinating to me, and very, very interesting how just so many skills, we were talking about earlier this morning, skills and qualities that really are passed down. And we can really see this through the archives and through the histories that we're able to collect. And it's just a really awesome opportunity to be able to firsthand read about those things. And I'm very, very excited to read the letters between her and her mother, Pearl Roberts. And so, yeah, it's really, really cool to just be able to read all of these things and feel like I'm actually connected to these individuals that I've actually never met. But it just is so cool to be able to really be in these intimate relationships with these family members through their words, how powerful they are.
Jenna, hearing you talking, I am so pleased that you are a collaborator. No, I am. Okay, I'll try not to. But you impressed me beyond words, and you've already been able to capture and kind of identify these family relationships, and you know who's connected to who, and there's so much to learn. We all have so much to learn always, but when you're talking about George Jack Pettiford and his self-determination and his insistence upon his identity and choosing his own identity and identifying that way, in talking about the arts and these skills that are passed on from generation to generation, I'm remembering that Madison Hemmings, his 1873 account in the Pike County Republican, where he describes his mother, Sally Hemings, describes his father, Thomas Jefferson, describes life at Monticello. He is the only one of his siblings, his three other siblings, to identify as Black, to be known as such. And so he is courageous to come out in a community which was then majority white in 1873 to tell his truth, to tell about life here, to get word across the generations. And as Dr. Diane Swan Wright would say, this was her highest compliment to anyone. She would say his only friend was truth. And that's what we're about here, is listening for the truth, recording it, preserving it, and then relating it to our audience. And so you hit the nail on the head. I'm so impressed. Well, we're coming to our end here. I'm just going to check to see if any questions have come in. I can see from Chester, who asks if we will continue to interview future generations and what they might add to what their parents and grandparents said. I have every intention that we will continue to do this work, to do more oral histories, and we may not be learning more about, in these oral histories, we may not be learning more about enslavement under Thomas Jefferson. I doubt that there will be much more information that will be revealed in those stories, but what they will tell, what they will continue to tell, is the story of freedom in the United States. And so for that reason, we must continue to do these stories. And I've been thinking for a while about Getting Word as a parallel, a very different kind of parallel to a sociological project that is colloquially known as the Harvard Project, which traced one Harvard class of young men who were all white men in Harvard in the early 20th century, traced them across a generation. And every 10 years or so, they would check in with said graduates and they would offer updates on their life and what they had accomplished in the previous 10 years, if they had families, what their jobs were like, and so on and so forth. And there would just be this amazing human history from this very elitist perspective, however, but still an amazing human history. And if we already have these generational histories in this archive here at Monticello with these families who have gone all over the world, let us continue to learn more about these very human stories. And so that would be my vision for doing more interviews. And I thank you, Chester, for asking that question, because it gives me a chance to get up on my soapbox to make those comparisons. But in addition to doing more interviews in the future, our priority, clearly, what we'd be focused on for the next several months is to continue to archive this project so we can prepare it for digitization. We think that the archive will be published digitally through the Jefferson Library, maybe sometime around next year. So there's a lot of behind the scenes work, as you can see on the video. We need to edit the interview transcripts and standardize them, index them. There's so much work to be done, which is why I'm so glad that we have such a terrific team together. And we need to learn more about the other families enslaved by Jefferson and families who were also enslaved by the Levies during the Levy era of occupation of Monticello between the mid-1830s up until the end of the Civil War. So there's many more people to reach out to, many more people to listen and learn from, and we are here to be a resource for people who are seeking out more information about their ancestors and also attempting to meet other people through the project. And then immediately also, we are preparing for a gathering in June to invite descendants back on Juneteenth weekend, June 17th and 18th. So stay tuned, there'll be much more to share. We thank you for coming to this live stream for the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, and we will continue together to study the past, to learn from it, so that way we can critique the present and chart a better future together. Thank you.